I think, oh, we're waiting to online segment. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. We have a good crowd here, but we also have a large crowd that's online. We have fantastic. It shows interest. Tell me when we're okay. I don't have to listen to myself talk. So we have a good crowd, and then obviously it's partly because Zach is well known and doing great work. And also obviously the topic of the book, which is our conversation with the author, and there are other authors, but Zach is our first on in the line. Metrics That Matter, and this is Johns Hopkins University Press. So, you know, if you're interested, it's digestible. It's a good size. It's not overly thick and well written. I enjoyed reading it. So Zach is currently an assistant professor of economics at Princeton University. And he has in the industrial relations section. He's also an research associate of the Center for Studies in Higher Ed, which is, sponsoring this event. And also the Opportunity Insights. I don't think I know what that is.
The Raj Chetty group.
Oh, it is the Raj Chetty. All right. Okay. And I want to note that we have co-sponsors as the Department of Economics here, and also the School of Education. Also, Zach has had a long association with the center. We were just talking about it. I think, you said, 2016 you started being associated while he was working on his PhD and here at Berkeley, but also before that, he was at the Federal Reserve. So I should note that I'm John Douglas. I'm at the center, and I'm going to help guide us through a little discussion about the book. We're going to keep it to an hour. Format is we're going to chat. He's got a short PowerPoint, and I'll kind of have questions for him. And then, eventually we'll get to some questions from the audience or some online. So keep that in mind as we go through this. So, one thing I just want a few little comments was, again, I thought the book was really well written. I think there's a thematic element, which he'll probably reiterate, is that metrics matter, but most are flawed. And he goes very systematically with his co-authors as to not so much maybe the metrics, but how they're used and interpreted to create a lot of commercial products that are guiding student decisions and family decisions. So, and the other thing I think that's I just want to note before we get into the questions and answers and presentations is that, sometimes I think we have a hard time, especially when we're at a place like Princeton or at Berkeley. We think of higher ed in these kind of elite institutions, but where do students actually go to college, and how many are, you do discuss this, of course, how many are selective? There's different ways of looking at that. It could be 6% of a total enrollment or 10% of institutions. I don't know, some number around that. And that a lot of students in the United States go to community college or go to other kinds of less selective institutions. So, well, again, your book is pointing towards people who are really looking towards that market that's more selective to help them guide. But I just want to kind of, again, note the reality of what's happening out there in the world. So, Zach, my first question to you is, why did you write this book?
Yeah, so thanks so much, John, for the invitation to come speak to you all. Thanks to all of you for being here. I'm thrilled to be back at Berkeley. I spent 6 years here as a PhD student. All of my research as an academic economist has been studying student outcomes from UC Berkeley and the other UC campuses. And so I don't know, for me, it's very exciting to come back and talk about this book. It's a book that started while I was a grad student here. I was a third-year PhD student in the economics department. And like many PhD students, I would have done anything for a buck, right? So the funding package was relatively weak. And I was really interested in higher education. I was just starting some work on undergraduate admissions policies inside the University of California, focusing primarily on race-neutral alternatives to race-based affirmative action. And I noticed this sort of interesting project proposal that was just sent out through some Berkeley listserv, focused on what at the time was called like critical university studies. So this is a humanistic group that was interested in statistical analysis of universities. And it was a proposal posted by the UC Humanities Research Institute, which is, I think, a really fascinating institute. It's a system-wide organization, but it's based at UC Irvine. And UCHRI does annual or semi-annual residential research fellowships, gathering people across disciplines with interests that overlap, with the goal of producing cross-disciplinary work on some area of study. And Chris Newfield, who is a professor of English at UC Santa Barbara and has been working in this critical university studies space for a couple of decades, was organizing a group at UCHRI oriented around university metrics. And Chris's real fundamental sort of starting question was a question of how metrics were skewing the priorities of public research universities. So rankings organizations like US News were posting rankings. Those rankings were sort of sausages constructed out of various numbers made public by the federal government and by universities themselves. Those rankings were then seen as very important by university administrators who were making choices about actual funding and on the ground policy changes at universities in order to target increasing rankings. And in some cases, once these metrics became targets, they led universities to make really bad choices, choices that were harmful to students in a variety of ways. And I'll talk about some of those ways in the next hour. So Chris wanted to gather a group of cross-disciplinary scholars, really just to investigate that question of like, in what ways are universities being corrupted by the numbers that are made available by universities and media organizations to the public. So 7 of us, there were 2 economists, 2 qualitative social scientists, and a couple of people from humanities disciplines, spent 3 months at UC Irvine in the spring of 2018. I, as an economics PhD student, never told my advisors that I was participating in this group because they would have been very disappointed that it was pulling me away from my disciplinary research. But it paid a stipend, so that was fantastic. I was able to travel back and forth, so I spent Monday through Thursday down at Irvine and then the weekend back here at Berkeley. And over the course of a semester, we realized that while there was some interesting work to be done in the sort of corruption of universities by metrics, there was sort of a more basic question that we realized was really important and not being filled, which is that all of this information was being made available to the public about universities, but it was in many cases very difficult to interpret, not just by rankings organizations who were using information in pretty unusual ways to make recommendations to kids about where to go to college, but by kids themselves who were choosing whether to go to college, where to go to college, and what to study, despite the fact that there was a large body of academic research that really should have helped people a lot make important decisions in each of these various questions using available data. And we realized that there was really a lot of open space that we've hoped to at least partially fill by this book, in really just sort of translating academic research, primarily coming out of economics and other empirical statistical science disciplines, but also coming from the humanities and elsewhere, just in trying to sort of explain to people, given the deluge of information that is available about different universities, about different programs within universities, how could that information be best used to make important decisions by 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds. And so we wrote this book. It's a 7-chapter book, and each chapter just has the name of a metric as the chapter title. Here, actually, if people can see the slides, I hope you can online. I just sort of pulled out here the 7 metrics that the book talks through. And the gist of each chapter is first to literally define what is this metric? What is this number? University ranking, sticker price of tuition, average wage by major, social mobility ranking or index of universities. Literally, how are these things constructed? How could they be used by people who are making important decisions? And what are the problems with using these numbers? Like, in what way is it somewhat frustrating if you're like your goal, even if your strict goal was to choose the major that will make you the most money? Like, is it a good idea to just choose the major that has the highest average wage? If your strict goal is to go to the school that will sort of open the most doors for you in life, is the right way of doing that to maximize the ranking of the university that you enroll? In many cases, the answer to these questions, in almost all cases, the answer to these questions is no. And so then the chapters make some concrete recommendations. In what ways can the scholarly literature sort of inform people about better ways of using available metrics, some of which aren't necessarily the most popular or widely used metrics, to help kids actually make these choices? And so each chapter sort of ends with this concrete recommendation. So that's the gist of the book. It's honestly a little bit embarrassing to be presenting the book to this audience, because this is an audience that I suspect already knows many of the things in the book. This is really a book targeted toward young people. I see a couple of students in the room, and I hope there are more online. But to the degree that there are actually people who are trying to make really difficult decisions with available data, which is never quite the data that you need to make these decisions. What's the most useful way of using all this available information? So there's the long-winded answer to the question of like, where did this book come from? And then what was the goal, or what did we hope to accomplish with the book?
So now you had a few more slides related to.
Yeah, so I just thought I'd lead people through a couple of chapters just to give sort of a flavor of what we're talking about here. So maybe I'll click to the first slide here. So these slides are very simple. Basically, all I wanted to do is talk you through, in this case, a chapter about college rankings, something that I think is, well, today very much on the front of people's minds. I know the Wall Street Journal released their university rankings yesterday. They're the first very public rankings organization to try to rank universities, not just in terms of level student outcomes, but in terms of value add, the degree to which universities benefit students. They did so in ways that are probably the best available given publicly available data, though I think there are still serious problems with the way that even this kind of value add ranking is constructed. But just taking a step back, like what is the purpose of rankings? I think the purpose of rankings is to help people make choices about where to go to college. And rankings are only one of many, many pieces of information that are available across universities that are made public in order to help people make these cross-university decisions. Rankings are in many ways just like a weighted average of all of these various other pieces of information that are sort of supposed to be weighted in such a way as to maximally inform students. So you're not just looking at instructional expenditure per student and the results of a survey in which people reported how reputable a given university is, but you're taking sort of all this information together, and different media organizations are sort of weighting this information differently to come up with an ultimate ranking of schools. So the chapter just goes through the construction of the most prominently used of these rankings, the US News rankings, as well as some other ranking systems, discusses some problems with their use. But really the fundamental point that the chapter tries to drive home is that small differences between universities in terms of rankings usually mean nothing in terms of students' long-run outcomes. So a paper that's, I think, it's now been around 20 years. It's well known in many circles, is some I think very convincing work that was done in the early 2000s by Alan Kruger and Stacey Dale, looking at relative returns to super elite universities. And actually, this is work that was corroborated about 2 months ago by this Ivy Plus paper put out by Raj Chetty and co-authors, that focuses on kids who are going to universities that, according to US News, are like the 30 or 40 top universities in the US, and asks, what happens when a kid chooses to go to the 10th ranked university instead of the 15th? Small differences that in terms of ranking space seem pretty big. And so what this study does is compare similar students who make different choices and finds that at least in terms of career outcomes, the kinds of jobs that are available to these students, it looks like there are no observable long-run differences between the students who go to these schools, all of which are very highly ranked, but which have these rank differences between schools. This work that came out after the book was published by Raj Chetty and co-authors find the same thing. Access to the Ivy League has no average change in kids' long-run employment outcomes as measured by wages. There's maybe some evidence that getting access to the Ivy League could increase kids' likelihood of achieving sort of a certain kind of elite status in society, but that's not measurable in terms of just the rank order of their long-run career outcomes. So, okay, so it seems like small differences between rankings don't matter very much, but large differences in rankings can matter tremendously. So The figure that I put up here is a figure that comes from some work that I've done on Proposition 209 in California, which banned race-based affirmative action in the state 25 years ago. The work that I've done on Prop 209 essentially shows that losing access to selective universities for the disadvantaged Black and Hispanic students who had prior to Prop 209 gained access through race-based affirmative action was extremely costly to those students. So, students who had previously gone to, say, a mid-level University of California campus, but because of the end of race-based affirmative action, had to go to a local comprehensive university, a California State University, in some cases a community college instead. Those students saw pretty substantial long-run deterioration of educational outcomes and labor market outcomes. And so there's sort of a question of like, how do you square these two things against each other? On the one hand, small differences between rankings don't matter very much. On the other hand, when affirmative action ends, this seems very costly to Black and Hispanic students. And what it looks like is going on is that when you are talking not just about like differences between super elite universities, but between large public research universities and local comprehensive universities, or between four-year schools and two-year schools, the differences between universities matter a lot. And a useful way of indexing the degree to which they matter is just the 6-year graduation rate of those institutions. Or in other words, rankings, which are the sort of agglomeration of lots of different information about schools, actually capture less information about the relative value of those schools to their students as just a very simple measure, which is the share of the students at that university who earn a college degree within 6 years of showing up at that institution. This is sort of interesting. If you just look at the most elite universities in the country, you'll see that basically all of their graduation rates are the same, and they're very close to 100%. And so if you just compare schools in like the top 25 of a ranking, or within many other ranges, like between 75 and 100, between 150 and 200, you'll see that the graduation rates of those schools hardly vary. And that's for a reason, right? In fact, those schools' relative quality or value to students seems to be relatively uniform. But if you look at schools with very different graduation rates coming from very different parts of this sort of university's quality or spending or ranking distribution, you see that outcomes differ very substantially. And so we think that graduation rate is a much more useful metric, not just because it captures information better than rankings, but because it really emphasizes that there are a lot of schools that are essentially equivalent to each other in terms of average value provided to students. And you can see that in a way that you can't see with rankings, where everything has to be relative to something else, where it's relatively rare that you have two schools at exactly the same ranking level. There's a lot more similarities across schools than you would expect otherwise. And a lot of the work that I've done on Prop 209 and related admissions policies in California suggests that you could almost exactly guess what's going to happen to students who lose access to selective universities just by the relative gap in college graduation rates that you see between the schools that these kids get pushed out of and the schools that they enroll at instead after these policies, in the case of affirmative action, end, or in the case of policies like eligibility in a local context or holistic review, et cetera, begin.
So maybe we should keep going. One thing you might want to jump to is the majors.
Perfect.
And then we could go into a general conversation. Maybe.
Awesome. So yeah, let me just give you sort of one other example of the chapters that we go through. I'm going to click through a couple. And so just tell you a little bit about social mobility indices of universities. So this again was, I think, first popularized by the Chetty Group in the New York Times in 2014. That made these mobility rankings of universities publicly available, showing people across institutions which schools had what was called like the greatest social mobility impact, which is to say the most low-income students who ended up being high-income graduates years later. There's also now been a series of information made available at the college major level. So you can see which majors tend to enroll relatively low-income students and produce relatively high-income graduates. And this is information that's now being used by students in both of these sort of important decisions of where to go to college and what to study, trying to get a sense, especially for kids from relatively disadvantaged backgrounds, of which programs will be most helpful to those students. What's challenging about these questions of like which programs turn low-income kids into high-income kids is that all of this available evidence on social mobility indices is what we would call in economics, it's observational evidence. It's not causal evidence. It's not the case that just because a program happens to enroll a bunch of really high-performing low-income students who end up being successful later in life, necessarily that the program is the reason that those students became successful later in life. And especially as people are making choices about either where to go to school based on the kinds of majors they want to earn at that institution, or choosing then between majors, we think it can be really misleading to try to make choices on the basis of where other low-income kids have gone and succeeded.
And one thing that if I recall from the book that was also an interesting observation is that the data that is used doesn't include students who go on to graduate school, correct? So that would be a big factor in the social sciences and perhaps some of the humanities as well, is that that cohort isn't getting registered in terms of their income.
Totally.
On, right? Correct?
Yeah. So there's lots of problems with available metrics on the relative value of college majors. Most available metrics exclude graduate students, which is a key pool of successful kids out of many humanities disciplines. Most average wage by major statistics omit kids who don't end up earning a college degree, or omit kids who end up exiting the labor market. And the remaining students may not be representative of students who are making choices between these majors. And then many of these statistics are measured very soon after kids graduate from college. And so they sort of haven't given kids a chance to integrate into the labor market and achieve whatever it is that the skill set that they learned in college could lead them to achieve. The book goes through a plethora of reasons that make it really challenging to understand relative wage values across majors. It also discusses what we think of as like really key information as people are making choices both across majors and across institutions, which is the just ability to earn a given major at institutions. So the figure I put up here is a figure that originally came from one of the chapters in the book, though was republished in a Brookings brief that summarizes that chapter. And it's just looking at, for kids who enroll at R1 public universities in the US, what share of them are in majors that you have to apply and be admitted into even inside of the university? So you show up as a freshman, you take a bunch of classes, but if you don't achieve some certain level of performance in your first year, you're going to be excluded from these majors. And what you can see here is about a third of all majors and about half of majors that are relatively lucrative or seem to lead people to relatively successful labor market outcomes, majors in STEM fields, in economics, in business, in nursing, et cetera. These majors are highly restricted inside of universities, though there's a lot of variation across schools in which majors are restricted. And I think this is really key information, much actually more important information than social mobility indices, as kids are choosing between institutions if they have a given major in mind. It's going to be a really important question of like, are you going to be able to study that thing at the school where you enroll? And in a lot of cases, the answer to that question is no, especially if you want to study things like computer science, economics, business, nursing, very high demand majors that especially at the selected public universities of the US have become in many cases very difficult to achieve for especially for relatively disadvantaged students coming in as first years. That's sort of like another example of just like a metric that our sense is no one really, or very few 18-year-olds are paying attention to. Am I going to be allowed into a given major after I show up at a school? But that's of really paramount importance for kids who have a very specific major in mind and who could end up just being sloughed into something else that they may not necessarily want to earn if they're sort of pushed into it by the institution where they choose to enroll.
Okay, great. Just one comment related to rankings is that it makes a lot of money for certain companies, so it's good to produce lots of variations of the theme of rankings. And the other thing is that it has a very significant impact and internationally, but it more is, yes, it is a consumer guide, but it is also used by governments, has been used by governments as to how to allocate resources and internal mechanisms of management at universities. So it has even more pervasive kind of impact, this seeking of metrics to try to explain the value of higher ed in society in various ways. So, one thing I wanted to transition a little bit to was this recent magazine article that we chatted about, New York Times magazine article that had a series of some things, information we know, and some new information or new studies. One is that general observation that enrollments are going down in higher education, but if you have to like the diversity of institutions, you have to look at where that's happening. A lot of it's happened at community colleges and for profit. Graduate education is still growing in various forms. So it's a more mixed message than simply an overall decline, and whether population is decreasing in Pennsylvania versus California or Texas, that kind of thing. But the other part was that there was decreasing interest. There's various polling in going to higher education. And that links largely, it appears, or that discussion is that return on investment, that there's a perception, partly through these metrics, but maybe other reasons. There's also political divide. Republicans keep showing up as showing a lot less interested in higher education for their children because they see it as a liberal bastion or various others, or they don't see the economic outcome as clearly, and then maybe they see it more so than a liberal. Who knows? There's some kind of dichotomy there. But this other study that relates to it, and then I'll let you answer, is the study that looks at the lens of net worth over time, which you do in your book to some degree, are looking at student debt issues. So in other words, when you're looking at return on investment, how does that calculate into this growing student debt, which again is also kind of in various pockets. It's not clearly understood by the public that a lot of the debt is for people going to professional schools or that didn't graduate out of for-profits. So that, again, a lot of mixed things going on, and to understand really what's happening. But this lens of net worth, they're saying generally that going to a good school, getting the right major, even then you can, depending on your socioeconomic background, are you taking out debt, it isn't a good investment is basically the concept. So sorry, a long explanation of some of that findings or what was displayed in that article. What's your sense about this lens of net worth? And then also, how do we perceive, is this a growing trend in which people are going to say, hey, higher ed is just not worth it, at least some people?
Yeah, so I hope many people saw this article by Paul Tough in last weekend's New York Times. The article, I think, was primarily focused exactly on this metric of return on investment. And the way that the return on investment was calculated in this article, they talked through two studies. One that's measuring wealth at the institution level, another that's measuring income at the institution by major level. And what the article was pointing out is that if you match these like average income by institution or average wealth by institution measures to the average debt of students at given institutions or in institution major pairs, you see that in a lot of cases, it would take many years for the average income of students in these various programs to pay off the cost of those programs for many students. And so the article was I think sort of pushing evidence that there are some students for whom college enrollment is a really bad choice, and that over time, or rather over the last 10 years, as we've seen declines in college enrollment, one reason for that may be that for the students who are no longer enrolling at college, college is not worth it for those students. So the first chapter of our book, it goes through this kind of return on investment argument. I think there are a couple of things to say about it. The first is that in distinguishing between average wages and the causal effect of wages on wages of enrolling at a given program, on average, and this has now been seen in studies on higher education for the last 25 years, the causal return to college pretty substantially exceeds the average wage return or what's the observational wage return to various programs. And this is going to be especially true in programs that enroll relatively disadvantaged students. So we now have a series of studies, I think most prominently by Seth Zimmerman about 10 years ago, looking at access to Florida International University. There are now similar studies of the University of Georgia system and of the UMass system in Massachusetts, where you look at people who are barely allowed, not even guaranteed admission, but who are just barely eligible to be permitted to enroll at a given state's public university system. So we're not talking about the flagships in these states. We're talking about access to the lowest tier of public universities, which are generally relatively non-selective public schools, Florida International, or the UMass schools in the Boston area, or relatively less selective schools in Georgia, schools that are available to students so long as you get, say, a 2 or a 2.5 high school GPA, or so long as you score a relatively low average score on your SAT. And what you can do is just compare students who are barely eligible for these universities or these programs inside of universities to kids who are excluded from these schools because they didn't quite make this cutoff. And what you see is very large long-run returns in terms of labor market outcomes for kids who are barely allowed to enroll at these schools, or enrolling at schools that are relatively non-selective, but who nevertheless derive substantially greater value than you would have guessed just based on the average wages of, say, kids who typically enroll at those universities and kids who are high school graduates. The reason for that is that kids who enroll at these universities are relatively negatively selected. They come from relatively disadvantaged backgrounds. Whether or not they enrolled at college, they were not going to be super successful in the labor market. College gave them a big leg up. It didn't turn them into the kinds of people or the kinds of jobs that are already accessible to relatively kids from relatively higher income backgrounds who didn't need university to sort of get ahead in life. It didn't necessarily close that gap, but it shrunk that gap considerably for these disadvantaged students enrolling at these schools. So that's at least one, I think, pretty important piece of evidence that these return on investment calculators tend to underestimate the relative value of a university degree. Something very similar is going on across college majors. So I just want to talk about, for me, at least one of my sort of generally favorite studies in the economics of higher education. I'm going to show you a table here. That comes from a paper by Lars Kirkeboe, Ed Leuven, and Magne Mogstad that focuses on the country of Norway. So Norway is a quite different higher education system than the US. Kids who are coming out of high school apply directly into a university major pair. And it's a centralized admissions process. So you send in like a rank order list of like, my first choice is to do economics at Oslo, and my second choice is computer science at Oslo. My third choice is economics at Bergen, et cetera. And so you send in this rank order list, and then there's a centralized allocation scheme where kids basically get points on the basis of their high school grades and their age. And then the people with the most points get into their most preferred program. The people with the second most points get into their second preferred program, all the way down. And so what this study allows us to do is to look at two kinds of kids. So I'm going to focus on these two sort of numbers in the top left-hand side. Let me explain exactly what these numbers are. So there's one group of kids whose first choice major is in the humanities and whose second choice major is in the social sciences. And some of them were allowed to study humanities and some of them had to study social sciences instead. But then there's a different group of kids. There's kids who really wanted to study social sciences first and humanities second, and who weren't able to get into social science and had to do humanities instead, et cetera. And so what this graph or what this table is showing us is compare those two pairs of students. Kids who just got into social science and otherwise would have had to study humanities, and kids who just got into humanities, but who otherwise would have had to study social science in this whole centralized allocation scheme. Now, on average, wages in the humanities are lower than wages in the social sciences. That's true in Norway as it is here. And so you might expect that kids who are just barely allowed into humanities are going to be losers in terms of long-run wage outcomes, where kids who just get into social sciences but would have otherwise studied humanities would be winners in long-run outcomes. And that's not what happens. So if you just look at this sort of the first three columns in this table, you see all the numbers are positive. What that means is that the kids who were allowed to study their more preferred field always won in terms of humanities, social science, and natural science. In other words, even if you were being moved from a less high earning to a more high earning major in these Norwegian universities, so long as you were getting into your more preferred major, you ended up with relatively more positive long-run outcomes than kids who were sort of sloughed into their second choice major. Now, that's not always true. If you look at the farthest right column, you'll see negative numbers for engineering. So even if you really want to study humanities, if you get forced into engineering instead, your wages go up. Engineering is the kind of major that no matter your preferences, the sort of the average effect of engineering is going to outweigh the preference effect of just doing what it is you want to do. But in cases where the relative economic value of two majors is pretty similar, preferences actually play a really important role. Being allowed to study what you want to study actually seems to lead people to relatively more successful labor market outcomes than being forced to study something that you'd really rather not study. So that, I think, also really importantly plays into these sort of return on investment value add arguments. Just aligning people with their preferences and letting them do what they want to do seems to have pretty substantial long run value for them that wouldn't just be captured by like the average outcomes of kids in that program. Actually, the value of these programs is higher for kids who really want them than for just like the average wage differences that you would observe otherwise. I think this is really a study that should be talked about more. I think it's super exciting.
Well, let me kind of jump to a different related topic on return on investment. Is any kind of thinking about AI and how that will change the labor market and perhaps perceptions of the value of higher ed, or some, mixed answer to those questions?
Yeah. So again, it's a super interesting subject. I think the key way in which it overlaps with the questions that we're sort of thinking about here, very much from the perspective of the student, are questions about whether students should be computer science majors. And the computer science major has turned into something I think very interesting in American higher education in the last 10 years. There's been a massive increase in demand for computer science. I'm a new professor at Princeton right now, a tiny school that it basically enrolls 0 students. And at Princeton, there's sort of like the group of us new faculty who are coming into the university. Basically, all of the new faculty are computer science faculty. Princeton now enrolls about twice as many computer science students as economics students, which just 5 or 10 years ago was by far the largest major at the university. That's true at many private universities on the East Coast, but it's even more true at selective public universities, the schools that actually enroll and educate most Americans. In California, computer science has been growing just wildly, very successfully at both private and public schools for the last 10 years. And universities' reaction to the tremendous growth and demand for computer science skills has been to close access to those majors. So that's been true at Berkeley, where, if you look 10 years ago at like what it would take to be a computer science major in letters and sciences at Berkeley, the answer is nothing. Like you took 61A and B, and then you enrolled in the computer science major. And then I think starting in 2014, they imposed a GPA restriction that you had to get at least a 3.0 in 61A and B to be allowed into the into the computer science major. Then they had to raise that, I think in 2017 or 18 to a 3.3 GPA to be allowed into the computer science major. And then I think last year they switched away from the 3.3 and now it's just like a competitive application. So they even 3.3 wasn't enough to throttle demand for the computer science major. I know there's now discussion of even, not even allowing for like a competitive admissions process among Berkeley undergraduates. There's now just a conversation about a direct admissions pipeline where either you're directly admitted into the computer science major or you're just not allowed to be a computer science major at Berkeley. This has been replicated at many dozens of public universities across the US. And it's very challenging where on the one hand, students really believe that this is going to lead them to labor market success. And they believe that for reasons that are historically justified. If you look at what was the highest paying major coming out of the University of California in 1960? The answer, I think somewhat surprisingly, is computer science. And computer scientists who were 40 years old and had earned a University of California degree in the early 60s were earning something like 2.5 times the wages of the typical art major, the relatively lowest wage major at these universities. If you look in the 80s, it's the same story. Computer scientists making 2.5 times the art majors. If you look in the 2000s, it's the same story. Computer scientists make, right? This is true at age 30. It's true at age 50. There seem to be really substantial labor market returns. So kids are clearly following that, demanding skills that they believe to be valuable. At the same time, I think universities face a pretty substantial challenge in maintaining a liberal arts character in a world where kids really want this very specific set of technical skills that they believe will aid them in the labor market. I think that's a big reason that universities have been somewhat reticent to grow computer science departments, allow majors to grow as much as student demand. And so, sort of the way that AI plays into this is really just a question of whether universities are acting in some way in the student's interest by relatively pushing kids out of computer science majors out of concern that AI will essentially eat up a lot of the jobs that have led to very strong labor market outcomes for computer science majors. I think we have very little historical reason to believe that AI will interact with students in exactly this way, that it will reduce the return to access to the computer science major. But I think more than anything else, for this, from the student's perspective, as the student is thinking about like what is it that I want to learn in college, to me, the most important thing that AI points them to is that if they want to study computer science, data science, to develop these kinds of technical skills, it's really important to enroll at a school where you're going to be allowed to do that. And I suspect that a lot of people are going to make mistakes in the next couple of years, going to schools that are essentially unwilling to provide students with that kind of opportunity.
You know, there's kind of like a mixed message we're getting out there. And one is future labor market needs in California, for example, need some analysis that we need 1 million additional BAs to meet labor needs. And, you know, because California has a different labor market mix than, say, Ohio or something like that. And then on the other side, we see this kind of growing concern about AI creating, changing the nature of jobs, demand for certain jobs that would normally have a BA and or somebody has some higher level skill sets, some kind of a degree, that market might shift a lot. And that gets back to my question: is do you sense that that is going to erode the market for, say, not the elites? You know, I understand the Princeton's will still have its demand in a market share again, you know, or a Berkeley or UCLA, they got 100,000 applications for, you know, 6,000 spots or something like that. But do you feel like that this will have a significant impact on other sectors of the higher ed market, institutions that, you know, maybe you're going to see enrollment decline even more because people will perceive there are other paths to get short-term training or whatever? So.
Yeah, so my sense is that this is a very open question. We have, evidence from even very recent years that the long run value of enrolling at a community college relative to not going to any college at all, or enrolling at a local comprehensive university instead of a community college, or enrolling at a relatively selective public or private university relative to a school with, say, a graduation rate of 50 or 60%. That's locally oriented, that the relative value of these schools is very high. You know, one way that we discuss this in the book is, while people pay a lot of attention to the relative selectivity of universities, that selectivity is often just a proxy for what's really going on under the hood, which is the relative investment that universities are making in their students. And so just looking at instructional expenditures per student, which tends to be very highly correlated with graduation rates, but can provide a little bit of extra information about which universities are investing. If you look, for example, in the California context, these numbers are going to be plus or minus $1,000 or $2,000, but on average, instructional expenditure per student at the University of California is on the order of $24,000 or $25,000 a year, according to publicly available IPED statistics. Instructional expenditure per student at the CSUs is about $8,500 a year, and an instructional expenditure per student at the community colleges is about $2,000 or $2,500 a year. These are radical differences in just the degree to which universities are spending money to invest in their students. This gets reflected in tuition as well. And so, tuition at these three sectors of, $16,000, $8,000, and $2,000, at least in part explains these investment differences. But the differences in investment have really substantial long-run ramifications for the students who are enrolling at and learning at these institutions. To me, what's very unknown is to what degree the value of these institutions can be replicated by coding boot camps or by micro-credentials or by AI tutors. I don't think we've seen clear evidence that any of these programs can even maintain students in the programs for a long enough time to potentially replicate a college experience. We see retention in these programs is quite low. And so it could be that part of the value of college is literally just keeping kids there, right? That's actually part of what this sort of index of graduation rate across institutions is providing you in terms of information. Like a high graduation rate school is a school that keeps you in school. And keeping you in school is extremely valuable in the long run for those students. To the degree
that correlates also with full-time students.
Very much so.
That's totally different category if we're talking about part-time.
Very much. And
Yeah.
so, to the degree that, sort of alternative programs are able to replicate that kind of educational experience, I think it's totally plausible that, in the very long run, they could replicate and potentially replace the kind of education that's currently being provided in four-year universities. But we haven't seen any evidence, and certainly from the perspective of an 18-year-old making this kind of choice right now, no evidence that would be relevant to that 18-year-old about the relative value of these versus these alternative programs in comparison with the kind of 4 and 2 year educational sectors that are much more traditionally enrolled at in the US.
Well, let me go back to the expenditures side of it, because one of the things you say, and or your colleagues and you say, is spending per student is perhaps one of the best indicators of educational value. Okay, so that gets back to one, though, also the full-time student aspect and what support they have and all that. But in any case, so I want to just kind of go at this, because are you saying that that Stanford is a much better educational experience than Berkeley? If we look at student to faculty ratios as an indicator of the amount of money that is being spent per students, the student to faculty ratio, I don't know the exact number, maybe it might be 9 to 1 at Stanford, could be even lower. I think at Harvard it's 6 to 1 or something like that.
Yep.
And then there's the mix of graduate students and undergrads, and there's noise and all of that. At Berkeley, we're close to 25 to 1, depending on how you count ladder faculty. So it gets complicated, but there is this large gap, and it does note about expenditures. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, I have to be careful, I think, with choosing my words here.
I purposely picked the two.
So in talking about Berkeley and Stanford, so as I've mentioned, I think the sort of two most useful metrics to kids who are making choices across institutions, at least that are currently publicly available, are graduation rates and instructional expenditures per student, two metrics that we talk about a lot in the book. I'm going to be pulling these numbers to the best I can off the top of my head. I believe the 6-year graduation rate at Stanford right now is roughly 98 or 99%, and that the 6-year graduation rate at Berkeley is on the order of 85%. 94, great.
That's the 6-year.
Is the 6-year? No, I'll take it. Yeah.
Oh, it's gone up a lot.
Yeah. No, that has raised a lot over time. That's okay. So
there's the correlation of high tuition and
that's
getting out
unsurprising.
fast. But,
Yeah. So okay. So call it a 3 to 5 percentage point gap in graduation rates. No, for a long time, the graduation rate gap was much larger. And in terms of instructional expenditure per student, the gap is larger. So again, I don't know right now what the instructional expenditure per student at Stanford is. My guess is it's on the order of $70,000 or $80,000 a year, which could be as much as 3x the instructional expenditure per student at Berkeley. If you look then at long-run student outcomes, so just in terms of degree attainment and graduate school enrollment, the schools look fairly similar. In terms of labor market outcomes at Stanford are substantially stronger, but so are the incoming student body, just in terms of metrics like SAT scores, high school GPAs, et cetera. I think maybe the short answer to this question is, as I mentioned, differences that are relatively small between schools are meaningless to students. I think the instructional expenditure piece is probably relevant to students who are making this kind of choice. But I think that the fact that the graduation rates, honestly pretty surprising to me, are so similar, suggests a lot more similarity than might be sort of available in the public eye.
Yeah, I think I would say though, I like the concept that spending per student is a good indicator of educational value, but I think there is a question of scale, and there's ways to handle scale. But part of that scale is that a lot more students are in very large classes at Berkeley than they are at Stanford, even though obviously the lecture format is part of the research university kind of format. So another issue, and then I'll get a couple of questions from, if we have some online, okay, or I have a few from previous. Relates to sticker price, because this is another really great chapter in here. Again, I really encourage you to take a look at the book if you're interested, because they're digestible. You're dealing with data and stuff, but you're not getting lost in fancy correlations or other kinds of things. So it's very accessible. But on the sticker price issue, this is obviously something that's guiding students' behavior as to where they apply. I mean, the other thing we have to kind of keep in mind in looking at these application numbers is that, the average student who applies to Berkeley, for example, probably has at least 15 other applications out there, and there's differences in socioeconomic groups. But compared to 50 years ago, you maybe you'd apply to 2 or 3 places, and now so that creates noise in that application process. But sticker price seems to be still a major, uh, thing that makes students make decisions. And the other part is that generally, and you cite this, and this has been researched for some time, that students tend to overestimate, or their family overestimate the cost, not knowing the complexity of the financial aid thing, structure, which has gotten really, really crazily complicated often. So on the sticker price, you mentioned in there, and we did in this report you and I did on the finances for California higher for the UC system and historical and look forward, there is some movement towards kind of creating a more upfront pricing structure that you're taking into account. Well, that student is likely to be Pell Grant. I've got so much money because they're from this group or whatever. Obviously, race you can't use now, but so what say a little more about sticker price, and then also, is there a path for universities to deal with that issue when it's the complexity of financial aid is obviously challenging for many students, particularly from lower income groups?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. So right, so we have a chapter just talking about the cost of college. As I think people are very familiar with, if you were just to like Google right now, the price of a private university in the U.S., you'll find many universities that list sticker prices over $80,000 a year, inclusive of room, board, and tuition. And that clearly scares a lot of students away from applying to those universities, let alone enrolling at those schools. So yes, the chapter starts just by going through some relatively recent research that just tries to understand how sensitive people are to first, what are the actual sort of sticker prices of universities, what people then believe the prices of universities are, and whether you can change people's minds about whether they're going to apply to or enroll at schools just on the basis of this sort of aggregate statistics of like, here's on average what private and public universities cost in the United States. So a couple of things I think stand out there. First, relatively disadvantaged families, so families from lower income backgrounds or families where the parents did not attend college tend to substantially overestimate the average cost of a university enrollment, even on average for all students. They even more so overestimate the cost of college for families like them. So if you ask, families with relatively low household incomes, what they expect college would cost were one of their children to go to college, they report numbers that are in some cases, or actually in many cases, tens of thousands of dollars higher than the actual cost of, say, enrolling at even a non-selective local public university, let alone a relatively more selective private university where financial aid tends to be even more substantial for students from backgrounds like those of these families. So what seems very clear is that, for reasons that I think I won't get into here, which is sort of like, why is it that financial aid has gotten so complicated? Why is it that universities have chosen to post very high sticker prices and then offer very large financial aid packages to lower income students? But sort of taking that as given, what it's clear that this process has done is confused a lot of families about what it actually costs to go to college. And the attempts by universities to sort of piercing through this confusion have had very mixed success. So starting about 15 years ago, the federal government strongly incentivized and then required universities to post what they call net price calculators. I don't know if you've ever looked at these, but basically every university now has one. You go to the university's financial aid website, you type in a ton of information. They're very clunky and honestly very difficult to use. I think, at least to the best of my recollection, I have never successfully used one of these net price calculators. You need to have a tremendous amount of information about your family finances, and every box needs to be filled in or the thing won't work. And so that, right, yeah. So that's the thing. Like these things are very difficult to use. And if you do succeed in using these calculators, then the output that they provide tends to be very disparate. Right, like you're going to have to pay somewhere between $10,000 and $70,000 to enroll at this particular university. And you want to know what it would cost to go to some other university? You have to just start over and just go fill in all of the information in a somewhat different format at a different university. while on the one hand, this kind of family specific net price information is, I think, extremely important to 17 and 18-year-olds who are choosing between institutions, where to apply to, and ultimately where to enroll. It's in many cases very difficult to use. And so what we point out in the book is there's a small set of what are sort of, I think, best thought of as like second generation net price calculators. So actually I'll put up here. One of these calculators is called My Intuition. This is a calculator that was built by Phil Levine, who's at Wellesley College, but it's now a tool that's available from about, I think, 70 or 80 universities in the US. Somewhat confusingly, these are universities that still have their old net price calculator on their website. So you have to like click to the right place. But if you end up finding this My Intuition calculator, My Intuition asks 6 questions. So you go through just 6 slides. It's relatively simple information. You still do need to know, for example, how much money your parents make and how much money your parents have in the bank. But even if you don't know this information exactly, you can put in sort of like bands of information. And then the calculator gives you, I think, surprisingly precise, or in many cases, much more precise than a net cost calculator, pretty precise information about what it would cost for you to enroll at a given university, conditional on your admission to that school. Moreover, My Intuition is then sort of collated across all of the universities that have sort of bought into this calculator. So you don't have to fill in the information over and over again. You can just transfer this information and see the relative cost of enrolling at many different universities. So it's personalized, but it's also relatively simple to use. It saves a lot of time and effort relative to net price calculators. And we think this can just provide much more useful and sort of feasible information for 17 or 18-year-olds who are making these choices. Now, there's now some evidence of what we can think of as like a 3rd generation net price calculator, which is effectively just a guarantee by a university. Even before you apply to the school, the university says, oh, for people from your background or with your characteristics, here's what it would cost if you were to enroll at this institution. We've seen very few examples of that, but I think most prominently, the Michigan Hale experiment provides one example of that, where students are informed prior to application to the University of Michigan that, hey, just so you know, if the University of Michigan admits you, you will have a full ride at the University of Michigan. Now, these are kids who actually, if they were to submit the FAFSA, go through the full financial aid process, in almost all cases would have already been guaranteed a full ride at the University of Michigan just on the basis of their family incomes and relative need. But convincing kids up front before they send in an application that, hey, we've already figured this out. You don't have to go through that whole process. You are not going to be paying tuition if you enroll at the University of Michigan, seems extremely impactful in leading those kids to apply to and ultimately enroll at the University of Michigan.
Well, I think the University of California should be doing a version of this.
Yeah.
I mean, I know they should be looking at it's complicated when you make changes in commitments on financial aid, but I don't,
There's a lot.
But obviously it has a lot to do with trying to make sure that we have lower income students and underrepresented students, because the complexities of the financial aid system are crazy. I think we have room for one question from the audience, and then we're going to have to wrap up because we're close. Does anyone have a question? No. Greg, do you? You have to talk into the microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
How much research have you done on what difference does it actually make to students making decisions when they see a difference in wage returns?
Yeah. Great. So there's been a series of papers by Basit Zafar, who's now at the University of Michigan, and Matt Wiswall in Wisconsin, who are interested in exactly this question. Now, they've primarily focused, I think somewhat, though it's too bad, they primarily focused at students at NYU, which happens to have been the school where they both worked and were able to run these experiments a couple of years ago. But they ran experiments where they just selectively provided average cost information, average wage by major information to students. And then just saw if we tell kids that engineers make tons of money and humanities majors don't make that much money, do kids switch into engineering? This has been replicated by John Conlin at the University of Ohio with I think, somewhat parallel results. Basically, kids aren't very responsive to this wage by major information. I think, to the degree that, sort of researchers are paying a lot of attention, that newspapers and media organizations are paying a lot of attention to wage by major statistics, I think it's somewhat surprising that so few students actually change their preferences, let alone the majors that they actually end up earning as a result of these statistics. And I think the primary reason, or at least I think it's legitimate for kids to not respond to this information for many of the reasons that I've discussed and many more that are in the book. Or in other words, kids seem to know that this information is not necessarily indicative of the fact that if they were to switch into this major, then they would have more money as an engineer than as a political scientist. And that actually seems somewhat promising.
Okay, one more question.
Thank you very much. So I'm curious about, I feel like in this university is a promotion of, let's say, changing the status quo, and considering like the Black student population at UC Berkeley, which is about 2%, and talking about CS majors, which from hearsay is just about really a handful. And you mentioned your Proposition 209 turning against it, like how we actually turn these values into reality and changing such said status quo, and comparing that to other alternative options, like let's say trade school, community college, whatnot, and how that would relate to overall equity, considering labor wage increase in the long term versus like a social type of capital that they would gain through going to these exclusive universities, considering there are just so few of them in the first place.
Right. Yeah. So I think there's really two pieces to this question. There's a piece about how to widen access to selective universities for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And then there's a piece of like, okay, once these students enroll at these selective universities, how do we make sure that they have access to the kinds of college majors that they want to earn? And now it's worth emphasizing that in many cases, relatively disadvantaged students have a preference for more lucrative majors, exactly because like the reason that they want to go to this more selective school, the thing that they want to get out of higher education is more likely to be economic mobility, long run wage outcomes. And so I think so there's a lot of interesting work on the admissions side, a lot of which I focused on, but I'll say just a little bit about the second piece of that, which is, to the degree that universities restrict access to college majors on the basis of, say, freshman year grades or competitive applications among freshmen, a kind of policy that, as I already showed you, is extremely prevalent at American selective public universities. These are policies that explicitly stratify college majors. So, right, like, if you're only going to get into computer science, if you can earn a 3.3 GPA in your introductory computer science class, like who's going to get a 3.3 GPA in computer science? It's the kids whose high schools taught computer science, and so who already know computer science, who actually have less to learn at the university from a computer science major because they already know so much about computer science. And it's those kids who are being permitted to earn these relatively lucrative majors. As we increasingly shut down access to these relatively more lucrative majors, we're explicitly stratifying schools within universities, such that you end up with like the rich kids in the lucrative majors and the poor kids in the less lucrative majors. I think this is really problematic, and so something I've written about a lot.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this, like engineering, there are a lot of talented people that could be engineers that want to be engineering majors, but because the programs aren't large enough, but then there's huge resource questions and cultural things too as well. So Igor, you said you had one question from
there's
online?
a good crowd online that are listening to this talk, and there's a question which I think a good probably way to wrap up the discussion. How accessible and easy to find are the meaningful data like expenditure per student, ease of access to major, etc.? For example, can prospective applicants find this information to inform their decision, and how hard it is to find?
Fantastic. Yeah, that's actually, so I'm glad this came up. So, maybe I'll click back to, just like the sort of table that I started with, which is the set of like very publicly available statistics that I think are very much on the front of people's minds as they're making choices about whether to go to college, where to go to college, and what to study. And then the set of statistics that we would recommend people look at instead. And in some cases, the statistics that we recommend are very available, and in some cases, they're somewhat more difficult to find. So in all cases, the things that we recommend looking at are things that are publicly available. though some are easier to access than others. Things like 6-year graduation rates are very easy. You can literally just type in a university's name and graduation rate and it'll pop up. Instructional expenditure per student is a little bit more complicated. It is publicly available from the IPEDS database, and Google has become actually somewhat better of like, if you Google for average instructional expenditures per student, Google itself is providing this information, and there's a growing number of organizations and schools that are trying to make this information available, though frankly, I think it's a lot more difficult to find. And so one reason I think to focus on graduation rate is its ease of accessibility. College major restrictions are a fantastic example of this. There's basically no aggregation of college major restrictions in the US, something that we've now been talking to a lot of policymakers about changing. It's very, it can be very challenging of like, if there's a given university and a major you want to earn, you can go to that department's website and try to figure out, like what it would take to earn this major. And the departments often make it very non-transparent, exactly what you have to do to declare these majors. But we think it's really worth literally just going to these departmental websites and just trying to get a sense of like, what would I have to do if I was at that school to earn this major? There's exactly one university in the country, and I'll say it just here, it's UC Irvine. So Irvine has this wonderful website that's I think just called like changeofmajor.irvine.edu or something. Don't quote that. It's something very close to that. That just lists out for every major at UC Irvine, here's what you have to do to declare that major. I think it would be really beneficial if more universities were to put these websites together, and even better if a government agency were to start collecting this information. We have collected this information for the top, just for the full set of R1 public universities in the US. We're going to post that publicly very soon. But in the meantime, I think basically you've got to go department by department.
Great. Now, to conclude, I just wanted to do one quick quote from your book, because a lot of our discussion has been about the failures of Matrix or the problems with them. But the book also talks about, the need for a broader education that's not just transactional or seen as a path towards career. But obviously we can't ignore that. But to think more broadly about the educational experience of students, and you say, or you and your colleagues say, the quantitative metrics that have emerged in the last 20 years to make sense of higher education, which is also happening international in different ways, definitely, cannot tell us about democratic governance, public service, or the common good. And then you also say the message is that going to college is more is about more than money. It is also about more than just you. That's your larger role in society. And so in any case, I just wanted to conclude with that. I thought the book was really fantastic. A round of applause for our speaker. Thank you, Zach.
Hey, thanks very much.
And we're signing off. Thanks again. Okay.
No, thanks to you all.